I love Warhammer, and I want to get every nerd on the planet into Warhammer. I'm also a Marvel YouTuber. I make MCU videos, and I know a lot about Marvel Comics. And so in this video, I'm going to explain Warhammer in all of its glorious badassery using Marvel Comics terms. So if you're a Marvel Comics fan that has been Warhammer curious, this is the perfect video for you. And if you're a Warhammer fan, you will probably still find this video really fun and entertaining, as you might be surprised to find out how many of the things from Warhammer are in Marvel Comics. This might end up being one of the nerdiest videos ever put onto YouTube, and I'm fucking hyped to talk to you about this stuff. Let's begin. Start by talking about the magic system and the fictional history of both Marvel Comics and Warhammer. Because you see, it's important to remember that both Marvel Comics and the Warhammer universe are actually just extensions of real world history. In Marvel, you find cities like New York, Hong Kong, or Washington, D.C. And this was a big concept initially pushed by Stan Lee, and it was done to make the Marvel Comics stories feel more real. Now, there are, of course, stories in Marvel Comics that take place in the distant past and in the far future, but in both cases, they are an extension of real world history. And although this isn't brought up a lot, it's actually the same for Warhammer. The Warhammer universe is an extension of real world history as well. It is an actual path forward from humanity based on our history, albeit a really crazy science fiction future. And this is a really cool aspect of both franchises, because it means that our actual history is the same history that the characters in these stories and universes has experienced. At least relatively the same history, with some adjustments. And therefore, this conversation about fictional history blends into a conversation about the magic system for each IP. And it does so in a really interesting way. In Marvel Comics, things like witches, sorcerers, and demons exist, and all of these phenomena are explained as they're just being magic in that world, and there are also just magical creatures in that world. There are also other dimensions in Marvel where beings like demons can come from, and a lot of sorcerers in Marvel Comics draw power from those different dimensions, which is important. We'll come back to that in a second. However, in Warhammer, all of those things are because of the warp. So things from humanity's history or past, like myths, witches, sorcerers, dragons, etc., are all examples of regular humans tapping into the powers of the warp. And you gotta understand the warp if you're going to understand Warhammer. The warp is the magic system of Warhammer. It's basically a parallel universe to the material universe, and it has unlimited power. And lucky for you, there are a lot of examples of this in Marvel Comics as well. Marvel comic readers will remember things like the astral plane, limbo, the mindscape, and even different demonic realms, which, as we mentioned earlier, are all different dimensions or realms that magic users and even telepaths can tap into or potentially even travel to. In Marvel Comics, all thoughts and mental willpower share a connection to an actual realm called the astral plane. Telepaths can access this endless plane and even build things there with their telepathic abilities. The mindscape is a very similar concept, but it's made up of thoughts and dreams. Even the Doctor Strange MCU movie explains the dark dimension as a realm of endless darkness and power that corrupts those that tap into it. The warp in Warhammer is very similar to that concept, because mortal beings can tap into that power and are often corrupted by it. However, there's something you got to know about the warp that makes it completely different from the dark dimension. The warp is not a purely evil thing. You see, in Warhammer, the warp gets imprinted by the emotions or feelings that different beings that have a soul have. So as the galaxy was filled with more and more mortal beings, and those beings started having more emotions and beliefs, literal entities were created in the warp. And it eventually gets to the point where several chaos gods are created, and then those chaos gods do use a lot of the warp space to continuously try to break into the material plane and cause endless suffering. Now, interestingly, there are a few concepts from Marvel Comics that can help you understand that whole thing. I think the best one is actually Onslaught, who is a being that is literally created from emotion. Onslaught is the rage and hatred of Professor X and Magneto manifest together. This also probably has something to do with Professor X's immense telepathic abilities and his connection to the astral plane, which we mentioned earlier. But either way, Onslaught is a being of almost unfathomable power that's literally created from emotions. And this is just like the Chaos Gods in Warhammer. There are also beings in Marvel known as the Fear Lords, lords, which are kind of like lesser known. I think the most well-known one is probably Nightmare, who feeds off of people's dream. But again, it's like this very powerful being that can mess with people while they're dreaming and siphons off energy from them while they are dreaming. The fear makes him more powerful, thus the name Nightmare. There's also the Dweller in Darkness, who was actually in the Shang-Chi movie. Now, that being feeds off of people's fear as well. And remember that the place where they fight at the end of the film, that's in a different dimension. So this is a being trapped in a different dimension, influencing people in our real world in order to try and escape. That is almost exactly what's going on with the Chaos Gods. So instead of having multiple other dimensions with a variety of different kinds of entities that live within them like Marvel Comics, Warhammer instead has one endless parallel dimension called the War. And because of the various things that have happened with mortal beings over the 40,000 years of humanity's reign, but also just the millions of years before that, there are now 4 different Chaos Gods that, just like Nightmare, just like Onslaught, were created from emotions, feed off emotions, and try to corrupt people in the regular universe. All right, so that uses Marvel Comics terms to help explain the War, the Chaos Gods, and the lore and history of the Warhammer universe. Now that you got that down, let's talk about the Emperor. Now, the Emperor of Mankind is the most important character in the setting of Warhammer and the most powerful as well. And there are several Marvel Comics characters that can help us explain the Emperor and his different aspects. First, I want to talk about Wolverine and Sebastian Shaw. Now, these are both mutants. Wolverine obviously has his crazy healing factor, which basically makes him immortal. And because of this, Logan ends up viewing the world in a very different perspective. He has tried to help humanity a lot throughout his history, fighting in different big wars. The character of Sebastian Shaw isn't a true immortal like Wolverine, but due to his mutation, he lives for a long time. And Shaw uses this long life to rise to power in the 1800s and then consolidate a bunch of power over hundreds of years until the present day Marvel Comics point, where he creates the Hellfire Club and is just super wealthy and influential. The Emperor in Warhammer is similar to both of those Marvel Comics characters in that he is a perpetual. The Emperor cannot die. And he was also born into ancient Turkey when humanity was incredibly primitive. So he's been around for a long time, just like these other characters, trying to help. And of course, he's more than just being an immortal, and we're going to talk about more of his powers in a second here. But I think one of the central things to know about the Emperor is that he's been around for essentially the entire history of humanity, and he's tried many different ways to try and influence and help us. Now, in order to explain the Emperor's other powers in Warhammer, I think we need to look at a combination of characters from Marvel, including Doctor Doom, Professor X, and Mr. Sinister. Doctor Doom is a technologist and a sorcerer. He uses technology to increase his magical abilities. And remember that magic in the Marvel Comics lore is just taking energy from otherworldly realms and then using that energy to produce magic in the material world. Doctor Doom also uses time travel to see possible futures for humanity, and when he does this, he realizes that humanity's best chance is in a future in which he takes control of the entire planet. Professor X is a powerful telepath, of course, and he does use his power to protect the emerging mutant population. He can read minds, implant ideas, wipe or change memories, and he can access the astral plane. Using technology like Cerebro, Charles can enhance his already crazy strong powers. He's even been able to use those powers to help bring people back to life. During the Krakoa era, the resurrection protocols are invented, and Charles's place in this system was grabbing up the minds of different mutants so that after their bodies were recreated and their souls were essentially reinserted, Charles Xavier could then take all of their memories and implant them into this new body. And he did this by having Cerebro constantly on top of his head. Mr. Sinister actually helps Professor X accomplish all of this through his crazy gene manipulation and study. Nathaniel Essex was born a human, but essentially turns himself into a mutant through study of the X gene. Mr. Sinister has the most advanced gene crafting abilities in the Marvel setting, maybe only second to Beast in some stories, but he's done incredible things like creating a Jean Grey clone that even the Phoenix Force found as a suitable host, and he's cloned a ton of other mutants, including himself, and even created combinations or chimeras of other mutants, of which the Angel and Multiple Man combo was like my favorite. That was really cool. And yeah, man, the Emperor of Mankind is literally a combination of all of those characters. He is a sorcerer with powers on the level of Dr. Doom, and he uses tech to enhance those already crazy powers. He's a telepath that can manipulate people, erase memories, get people to see him in a different way, just like Professor X. And he's an expert in gene craft, just like Mr. Sinister. And if that just makes you think that he sounds like a completely busted and bonkered, overpowered motherfucker, that's because he is. Now, there's one more Marvel Comics comparison here that I think can really help flesh out the character of the Emperor. You now know about his power set, but let's talk a little bit more about the character. Like, what's this dude even doing? Interestingly, Professor X and Dr. Doom are still great examples of his motivation, but I'll add to the list the Maker in the current Ultimate universe. So let's start with Dr. Doom. In the classic Doom War story, Dr. Doom sees a future for humanity that is grim, and he decides to attack Wakanda in order to take control of the power of the vibranium to take over the world to prevent that bad future for humanity. There's even a point where he stands in front of the Panther god Bast and bears himself completely naked and allows Bast to see into his heart. And Victor explains his motivation. He's like, dude, I saw a super bad future for humanity. It's gonna suck unless Doom takes over the world. Bast looks into his heart and says, you know what? I think you're right, man. And it was really controversial, but Bast then gives Victor all the vibranium. Victor is able to tap into the vibranium power in a way that not even the Wakandans did. It was like super controversial. But Doom's just that guy. And of course, he's motivated by wanting to actually do the right thing for humanity, at least as far as he views it. Krakoa era Professor X is actually really similar to this character. I highly recommend reading at least House of X and Powers of X, those first two 6-issue runs that started off the Krakoa era, because essentially what happens is it's revealed that Moira McTaggart is a mutant, and she actually resets the timeline every time she dies, and she sees all kinds of futures that are really bad for the mutants and for humanity. Eventually she goes to Professor X. Professor X reads her mind and realizes she's not lying, and she has this ability, and she's seen the future. And Professor X completely snaps. He starts working with Magneto. He creates a whole mutant state on an island. He takes the mutants into immortality. He makes this medicine that humans get addicted to try to manipulate them. Professor X breaks bad and goes really crazy in the Krakoa era, and it's all because he sees a vision for humanity that's really bad and he wants to fix it. Now, the Maker is slightly different from these other two characters, but similar in the sense that the Maker knows all about the history of the 616 universe, and in the new Ultimates universe run, he essentially makes an offshoot of that universe and then manipulates a bunch of stuff to get it to a future he wants. And it's similar in the sense that the Maker thinks, because he knows the possible future, that he can manipulate things in the present to change the events to be the way he wants them to be. In all of these examples, you have really powerful and resourceful characters seeing a dark vision for the future and then acting harshly to prevent that future. In Warhammer 40k, the Emperor of Mankind does the exact same thing. He sees a really dark future for humanity and decides to step in and take command and control of all of the species. And it's then when the Emperor starts using those powers that we talked about before. So he uses the Dr. Doom warp sorcery and his Mr. Sinister-like gene crafting abilities, and he creates super soldiers and weapons to conquer the galaxy. Now, at this point in the Warhammer lore, humanity had already reached out in the galaxy and spread across the stars, but then some really bad shit happened. First, AI that was created to help us turns on us and almost destroys us, very similar to Age of Ultron from Marvel Comics. And the second thing was the creation of the fourth Chaos God, which happened from the fall of the Eldar. TLDR, the space elves became a bunch of gooners and created a new Chaos God. All of their souls got eaten. It tore up a bunch of holes in reality, caused a bunch of warp storms, and isolated the different human settlements on different worlds from each other. This period was known as the Dark Age of Technology, and it's the thing that finally pushes the Emperor to reveal himself and start his plans. So back to the super soldiers, Big E creates various versions of them. There were the Thunder Warriors, who were really unstable berserkers who were eventually destroyed by the Emperor and his custodians. He created these big golden sentinel beings called the Custodians that were exceptional killers and great companions, but incredibly hard to produce and therefore impractical for a full army. And as far as Marvel Comics examples to help you understand here, the Thunder Warriors strike me a lot like Nuke from Marvel Comics. This is a super soldier that would take pills to rage out and then calm down. And his super soldier powers were strong, but ultimately did drive him mad. The Custodians are more like Captain America or Steve Rogers because they're kind of flawless. And in the end, the Thunder Warriors and the Custodians were very useful in destroying the warlords of Earth and unifying the planet, but they would not be enough to conquer the entire galaxy. For that, the Emperor would create the Primarchs and the Space Marines. You've seen these guys a lot. The Space Marines are essentially the poster boys for Warhammer, and they are also somewhat of the grandsons of the Emperor because they are the sons of the Primarchs. And again, remember, all of this is done with Dr. Doom-like sorcery and the Mr. Sinister-like gene crafting. The Primarchs were demigods created by the Emperor, and essentially he took his own DNA and the DNA of another female perpetual, who, remember, is a lot like Wolverine, and then he used the warp shenanigans to create 20 or 21 of these beings. Then the genes from those Primarchs were used by the Emperor to create a lesser version of them, and that is the Space Marines. The Space Marines were led by their father Primarchs, and they would ultimately be the Emperor's primary tool for conquering the galaxy. Now, the best way to explain the Space Marines for Marvel Comics fans is that they were like juggernauts wearing a Hulkbuster Iron Man suit with weapons like the Punisher or Rocket Raccoon. That's the basics of what they are. Each Legion chapter had different unique attributes, but that's the basics. You have chapters like the Space Wolves that are very Viking inspired, and some of them even turn into werewolves. You have the Blood Angels that were created to be more beautiful and graceful than other Space Marines, but also kind of fell into this thing where they're like vampires and they drink blood, and some of them lose their minds. The Dark Angels have a very Arthurian middle-aged kind of a thing going on, but they're also so secretive that they're not really good allies. And don't worry, I will go into the differences of each faction in probably multiple videos in the future, because the density and specificity of the Warhammer lore is one of the best things about it. So I would actually love to just go on a tangent for each one of these, but then the video would be 6 hours long. For now, it's best to just understand the Space Marines as juggernaut-sized dudes in Hulkbuster suits with the weapons of Frank Castle or Rocket Raccoon. And the Primarchs are like a bigger version of that, but with the power of the Skyfathers from Marvel Comics. So imagine an Odin-level powerful being, or perhaps Thor when he has the Odin Force, or maybe the power of Galactus. That is the power level of your average Primarch. And for the Warhammer setting, this is like uber powerful. There are very few things in Warhammer more powerful than a Primarch. And just like the Space Marines, there are a lot of differences between each Primarch. They all have unique power sets and unique upbringing. Sanguinius was probably the strongest of the Primarchs, and he had the ability to see the future even better than the Emperor himself. He had incredible strength and grace and literal angel wings. However, he's ultimately destroyed by his brother Horus, who was also very powerful, but was juiced up on the powers of the Chaos Gods at the time, and so he was probably on the level of like a Phoenix Force Jean Grey. Some of the Primarchs can use the warp like a wizard, while others just use it to enhance their already great strength. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. So the Emperor of Mankind makes all of these super soldiers, but then the Chaos Gods scatter these Primarchs across the galaxy, so the Emperor has to go find them. Thus begins the Great Crusade. The Emperor, the Custodians, and the Space Marines go around from human world to human world and bring them into the glorious Imperium or nuke them out of existence. And the crusade goes pretty well, actually. I mean, there's a lot of like hiccups and wild shit, and that's a oversimplification. And remember, we will go into the details in future videos, but for now, we're just getting the basics here. So the Emperor goes around, he finds all of his sons, they all start taking planets over. 2 of them get out of hand, and he has to destroy them and wipe the memory of them from all of their brothers. It's like super shady. But for the most part, all the Primarchs get on board with the crusade, and it goes well. This all gets to a point where the Emperor then has to leave the front lines of battle and go back to Earth or Terra to work on the Webway project. Now, this is a very important part of the Warhammer story. This is a project started by the Eldar, or the Elves, who once ruled the galaxy. They were spread out way before humanity, and they were basically trying to create a way to teleport around the galaxy without going into the warp. To break this down in Marvel Comics terms, you gotta remember that space travel in Warhammer enters the warp, and then you exit back into real space. This is very similar to the character of Magic, who uses her portals, and then she uses stepping discs to travel through the dimension of limbo, and then come back into our universe. Very similar concepts. So the elves were trying to create a way to do that while not entering the warp so that they didn't have to worry about chaos. The Emperor wanted to finish this project, but for humans. And then there's the concept of the Astronomicon, which is a psychic beacon that the Emperor now keeps lit as he sits on the golden throne, halfway dead. This is very similar to the universal neural telepathic network of the Shi'ar Empire from the old X-Men comics. This is actually how Professor X was able to project his consciousness across planetary distances and have a long-distance relationship with Lilandra before she arrived on Earth. So it's similar to that, but it's also this beacon that holds back a bunch of demons from entering real space above Earth and destroying everything. And in one of the very first pieces of lore for the Warhammer game ever, like I'm talking all the way back to 1987, it is described that the Emperor sits on the golden throne, 1,000 psychers a day are sacrificed to keep him alive, and the whole reason this is happening is so that he can power the Astronomicon to keep all the demons out of our realm. And those are the closest Marvel Comics things that I can talk about to help you understand that, but essentially this is why the Emperor leaves the Crusade. He has to go fix the big telepathic lighthouse and finish the subway system that he's building underneath the warp. Unfortunately, after he leaves the front lines, his sons start acting a fool. This mostly happens with Horus, who was put in charge of the whole Imperial army after the Emperor leaves. You see, Horus and all of his brothers were told by their father that there were no gods. However, Horus finds out that not only are there actual gods, but that their father had made a deal with those gods for his power. And he kind of snaps and goes to meet with these chaos gods himself, which is like super shady. And then he becomes their champion, starts a civil war against his father, and tries to destroy the whole Imperium. And I think the best parallel here to this fall of Horus is the first Thor movie. In that film, Loki discovers he's not actually an Asgardian and not Odin's true son. Instead, he was the son of the king of the frost giants, who was taken by Odin and raised to be his son. Upon learning this, Loki decides to betray Odin, and he lets the frost giants into Asgard. And it's not a perfect example here, but it's essentially the fact that Horus, this son to this really powerful being, learns this secret, learns that his father was lying to him. He actually even learns that his father has erased some of his memory. And then he goes to Moloch, talks to the Chaos Gods, becomes their champion, and starts a civil war. So juiced up with Chaos God hacks, and given that he was the leader of the whole Imperial army, Horus is able to devastate the Imperium and slaughter countless soldiers, including many, many Space Marines. His rebellion takes him all the way to Earth, or Terra, and he tries to destroy the Emperor before the whole rest of the Imperial army shows up to save the day. Because remember, Horus was in charge of the whole army. Well, yeah, he orders some of the best of his brothers and their armies to like go away from Terra before he starts the rebellion. So he starts running out of time, and he decides to lower his shields on his flagship, which is known as the Vengeful Spirit. And he kind of invites his father, the Emperor, to just square up. The Emperor, who had been sitting on the golden throne because his son Magnus broke it with a Skype call, which is like a whole nother thing, but like, goddamn, Magnus. But yeah, so the Emperor finally gets off the golden throne. It's like the whole siege of Terra. He's just sitting there powering the Astronomicon, and everybody's like, bro, what the fuck? So he gets off the golden throne. He goes up to the spaceship with a couple of his Primarch sons. They fight Horus. Horus kills Sanguinius, which is so fucked up. Sanguinius was the best Primarch. He had literal angel wings. He's a beautiful hawk boy. He was very powerful. Even Horus loved him, but he had to kill him because like drama and shit. And then Horus and the Emperor have a massive psyker slash warp slash actual fight that spans time and space. The Emperor is mortally wounded, but he destroys Horus completely, destroying even his soul. Or so we thought, until a recent book came out in the past couple of years, which actually hints at the Emperor thinking that Horus' soul would survive and that he still loved his son at the end, which is super cool, but kind of like it's just a thing. Like, it's a thing. Anyway, the Emperor is basically half dead. Horus is gone, and then they take the Emperor, they put him back on the golden throne so he continues to power that Astronomicon thing. And from there, the Emperor exists in a state between life and death for all eternity as he powers the golden throne, keeping that thingy lit and trying to like help the webway and shit. And there are Marvel equivalents here as well, and I think the most recognizable one is the fate of Loki from the Loki show. At the end of season 2 of Loki, the character realizes the only way to help the timelines of the universe is to exist outside of time forever as you sit on a throne and hold the literal timeline together. And this is also very similar to Thanos in the Infinity Ending story from Marvel Comics in 2019. In this story, Thanos takes over the entire galaxy, but eventually is led to a similar fate to Loki, having to sit immobile, alone, and conscious for eternity as he keeps the cosmic balance from outside of everything. So the Emperor is condemned to a fate similar to those two characters, so he's, you know, just there. And then 10,000 years go by and shit gets worse and worse every year. It gets to the point where the whole Imperium worships the Emperor as a god, which is so ironic because he was trying to tell humanity there are no gods and he didn't want humanity to believe in gods. There's still endless war and humanity is constantly threatened by aliens, demons, or other humans. Shit is real bad and the Imperium is totally corrupt and rotting from within from all of its bureaucracy. I guess this is similar to Age of Ultron in Marvel Comics or maybe Age of Apocalypse. I guess the only difference is that it's happening on a million different worlds at the same time and not just Earth. And that basically gets you up to speed on all the Warhammer lore. That's Warhammer explained simply through Marvel Comics terms. I hope you enjoyed this one. I had a blast making this, and I've got more planned to explain Warhammer via Star Wars terms, DC Comics terms, and more.